Okay, who wants to do the
Right.
intro?
Tom,
Simon.
you wrote it.
yeah, it's fine. It's fine, I'll do it. Hello everyone, welcome to the Osinttechnical podcast in collaboration with the United Kingdom Defence Journal. Joining me is Jordan from Intel Air and Sea, John from Defence Geek, and Osinttechnical. Myself, Tom from Sierra Alpha. This is the first podcast in what could become a series should should people actually like what they're listening to. So we'll see, but as you may have seen from our tweets, been quite a few of them, we've been, I suppose, quite excited about what could become of this. We've got 3 topics lined up for discussion in this episode, with a brief summary of this week's events from John, following an in the end, in which we have not covered this episode. I mean, we decided really not to, am I right in saying, not to really concentrate on the Middle East this one, because I think there is an attitude that the world of geopolitics doesn't revolve entirely around the Middle East. There is room for discussion outside the Middle East. So I think that's the moral of our thinking behind this one. So, I guess stop dithering. First of our topics is the ongoing crisis in Texas. So
In fairness, I'll just have to interject on our plan to not talk about the Middle East sort of fell apart about 45 minutes ago when we saw that the U.S. had started to move anti-aircraft systems into northern Syria.
Oh wait,
so
yeah,
our entire plan not to talk about the Middle East in this episode really just fell apart very quickly.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
So from what we can see, tweet will be linked down below as the first one. It seems like the U.S. at least is flat betting in M197 Avenger short-range air defense systems. It's basically just Stinger missiles on a Humvee, which is interesting because it's more for targeting low-flying jets and basically helicopters and stuff like that. I'm not sure if they have drone defense packages. I know they were looking at attaching them to the Avenger system. So it may also be for drone interdiction. But on top of that, it gives you sort of idea that the U.S. is going to be sticking around in northern Syria and intends to be a bit harder to pick out. One interesting thing about this is it sort of shows the U.S.'s current strategy when it comes to sort of air defense in general. Really, the U.S. Army doesn't have its own self-contained, really high-level air defense systems. We sort of rely on the Air Force for most of our air defense work.
I think that's kind of common all across NATO, really. If you look in comparison to pretty much every NATO country, the only sort of proper, like, big-scale air defense system that exists amongst them is really the Patriot or THAAD from the US. All the other NATO countries are entirely dependent on their Air Force to
and
do
the
the
Aegis,
job for them.
the Aegis Ashore is sort of trying to move in the direction of a more area-based system based on land. But it's definitely different than former, Warsaw Pact nations that have that sort of integrated down to the, like, unit level, ground-based air defense with, of course, the Tunguska system, which is very threatening for anything trying to come into to an area. But it's definitely different with the U.S., and I think it's more responsive of what the U.S. has had to deal with over, the past 30 years, ever since the first Gulf War. It's dealt with complete air superiority. So, of course, you sometimes have to deal with helicopters. Stingers deal easily with them.
I think this is the first time, you might correct me, that we've actually seen evidence or photos of US air defense operating in Syria.
I believe it is, which is sort of why this is somewhat notable. Just the fact that we're seeing this as a new development in the region, and I honestly, if I'm to go out on a limb and make some guesses, I would assume it has something to do with potential threats from Assad, just at least in the area of Assad's current air power is really limited to helicopters right now. Most of the fixed-wing assets are provided by the Russians, so I think there's a potential they may be trying to protect from some sort of shenanigans in that area.
And it would be fair to say that the American presence in northern Syria has been mostly expeditionary, mostly small units, fairly mobile, moving around. Whereas obviously bringing in stingers now suggests that maybe with the withdrawal from Iraq, maybe they're moving stuff across the border into Syria.
Well,
To have a
they
more
brung in
permanent
Bradley's
presence
not
there.
that long ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Right before the pullout, last year? Yes. No, 2 years ago. Holy cow. Or year and a half ago. Right before, the whole Turkish interdiction in northern Syria, we saw most U.S. operations were out of a few large bases in northern Syria, mostly special operations, patrols, mostly MRAPs and your standard Oshkosh light utility style vehicles. And then after the pullout, and after we came back in, you saw more distributed, heavier based, more in kind to what we're seeing the Russians doing in northern Syria. That heavy armor, or not heavy armor, but more infantry based armor.
I think there might be something in that as well that tells us that the United States has received actionable intelligence about something. I mean, that's me putting my tinfoil hat on, but there's a good chance that they are moving.
Yeah, and
that particular area, they receive intelligence about something or impending attack or etc. etc.
Yeah, and a lot of the stuff we're seeing right now is also probably has a lot to do with the new administration, because we're a month into the new administration, 31 days at this point, and we're starting to see, tangible differences in a lot of those subject areas we're going to talk about today. And that's that, and we sort of have to draw out, what is, a change in position due to, some sort of evolution in the situation on the ground versus, a change in situation due to, new people we're seeing at the State Department and in the White House. And that's a big thing to try to cut through. And it's going to be hard.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, we're not going to touch on it today, but I think Yemen is a great example of, as what we've seen. President Biden removing the rebels off the terrorist designation list, which I think everyone who follows me on Twitter will know that is a. Yeah, I'm not even going to go into my feelings on that because
it's definitely a major policy shift.
Yeah. Exactly, it shows us that they are prepared to make significant policy changes on the flip of a dime. So I think Paul was right by saying that in light of a new administration, we're likely to see more, depending on countries and geopolitics. It's not going to be a question of moving out; it's a question of moving in.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it all comes down to that. So moving on to the next topic, of course, we're going to stay U.S. centric because I've hijacked this podcast now as the American. Haha. But Texas.
God's sake.
Texas and the vulnerabilities in the U.S. power grid and how it can affect the U.K. too. All right, guys, I'll make you feel better here. You also your power grid can also collapse as well. Don't act all high and mighty on me here. But for anyone who's confused about what happened and why, last week Texas had a fairly unusual cold snap. It was a few days in a row of below 32 degree Fahrenheit, 0 degree Celsius weather, along with some snow, ice, generally wintry weather. Texas homes are set up with a different form of heating called heat pumps, which is basically reverse air conditioning. So instead of blowing hot air outside and, or hot air outside, cold air inside, you're blowing cold air outside, hot air inside. And then the rest is done by electric resistance heating, which hugely inefficient, but it's Texas, it's normally warm, or not this cold. And then additionally, Texas, in order to avoid U.S. federal regulations, set up their own power grid. So that would be, there's basically in the North America, there's the East Coast, Eastern U.S. power grid. And then there's the western half of the country has a power grid along with Canada, and then Quebec is doing their own thing, sort of like Texas. But Texas having their own grid means they have, state level control over all their power generation. They have not been winterizing their power plants, which means not doing the necessary preparations to, guard against prolonged sub-zero, freezing temperatures. So what that did was, when this cold snap came, a bunch of power generation went offline. Wind power, solar power, and a lot of gas power, and also, I believe, a nuclear plant also went offline due to some freezing issues. So with that, sort of as this all sort of came together, utilities realized that they were going to have to shut off power. And at least according to some sources, linked down in the description, Texas was apparently minutes away from a complete failure in the grid, where basically when you don't purposely turn people off and you start getting grid failure, you have large amounts of equipment that gets damaged, which can take months and months to fix. So I know you guys can probably speak to this issue a bit more, but the UK has at least similar issues with gas generation and coal-fired plants. Not to the same level as Texas, but go ahead.
Well, to a certain extent, the UK is mostly moving on phasing out coal power plants altogether. But it must have been a few winters ago now when we had a shipment of, it was a particularly cold winter, and we had to rely on a gas ship, several LNG tank, some sort of tankers coming in from the Middle East.
Yeah,
we were dependent on them coming in. That must have been, what, I'm talking like 6-7 years ago, possibly.
Yeah, and I think...
And even more recently than that, I seem to recall we had, there was one winter in particular where just the amount of power production was just not at the standard it needed to be. And there was power outages in several parts of the UK for several weeks. And it made frontline news across the country. But
yeah, and that gets back to the failure in generation, which can, I mean, the grid is on a fine line all the time, because if you're not generating power, you're not making money, and if you're not making money, you don't want to be wasting money on a plant. So plants that aren't generating power actively are usually, shut down or in cold storage or in some phase of hibernation, which makes sudden spikes in demand or drops in generation really, really dangerous, because when, properties of electricity, when you generate electricity, it is immediately used by the consumer. So you have to be finely balancing your grid at all times. And, any failure in that can result in some pretty extreme results, as we saw in Texas.
Yeah, I mean, you can speak for yourself. I mean, when it comes to the US, I mean, here I think we know about localized power failures because we don't have power infrastructure on the same scale as you do. And that shows. I mean, we have power cuts for 20 minutes, comes back on, happy days. But I think in Texas, it's something we've not seen much of, especially in somewhere states where actually it took the government by such surprise that it more or less crippled the state. It's still ongoing, as you know. It's crippled the United States' biggest state in such a way where it can barely function, and that's quite alarming, I would say.
Yeah, and to sort of stay out of the political waters of this, of course, decision makers did, sort of
go to Cancun.
Yeah, and that too, but they definitely created the situation where, spending a bit more on actually, setting up the grid for winter conditions, because it does occasionally happen in Texas, and actually preparing the grid for more events like this may become at least more politically acceptable in the future, whether that ends up becoming more publicized.
Yeah, definitely. I think the idea that not many people consider power-related infrastructure when it comes to certain, geopolitical climate issues, and it's something that's really overlooked.
Mm. It's something we've seen quite keenly in Venezuela last year, with
Yes,
obviously
yeah.
the Maduro regime and the power outages there, often deliberately on the part of the government. But obviously with that comes internet outages, and so news about what's going on often doesn't get out of countries like that when things like that go on. And we're seeing it again in Myanmar now. The military coup there, and the government's been swept aside, and the military's taken over, and they've reduced power to a lot of places in order to prevent news about what's going on from getting out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and that's one of
Yeah.
the main reasons why we haven't reported on it as much, is because there isn't the content. There just isn't the news getting out of the country, and we're seeing, bits and pieces trickle out where people can actually get information out. But other than that, the military has been fairly effective in blocking out information. I mean, we've been relying on, at some point, satellite imagery to get photos of protests. I mean, it's sort of unprecedented.
Yeah, of course, and we're nearing a point where we can consider Myanmar as more or less a satellite state, both in a naming convention way, in a literal way, whereas you say we're now getting photos literally by satellite. That is the only way in which we can now visual confirmation of certain issues.
Yes, and of course, obviously Myanmar falling into the Chinese sphere of influence happened fairly quickly. To be honest, probably over the last 20 years, it really went from being sort of China adjacent to just a satellite state, basically, as you said.
Yeah,
And
yeah, it's quite effective the way the Chinese have been able to actually embed themselves in the very framework of Myanmar's. I mean, as we saw, I believe 2 weeks prior to the coup, generals met with senior Chinese.
oh no, the
officials,
Chinese foreign
and
minister
in that
visited.
space,
He visited 2 weeks before the coup.
visited.
Yes, visited. And
Wow.
that was, I mean, I had sent some tweets out about that, but it was pretty clear what was, I mean, afterwards, who this coup was backed by, who supported it, where this was coming from. I mean, it was pretty clear that it was completely Chinese supported. Which I think is partially why other countries haven't gotten involved as we thought they would have. Both from the outright support of China and potentially more quiet support in the form of practical assistance. And I can't get into more without going into super speculative territory that would probably be irresponsible to talk about. But it definitely the military government in Myanmar has the support of the Chinese government right now.
Definitely. And when we talk about been just now power infrastructure alongside issue in Myanmar, there is questions and a point to be made over morale of the public. You shut off power, no electricity, no social media, television, no radio access, etc., etc., and that eventually will take a toll on the public, and thus the public opinion of those who are doing such things. And as we can see with the growing protests in Myanmar, that is having that undesired effect.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time with that, when you cut off the public talking to each other, it does, limit the ability of the public to protest, and at the same time, it gives the Chinese or the military government there the ability to crack down much harder than we would otherwise see in other countries. And
Yeah.
we just don't know how much they're cracking down. We know they've shot at protesters. We know they're using weapons against protesters. We don't know much else.
No, I think it's been, I think words in which we can, fortunately, when it comes to that, has been quite effective in the way that they've gone about it. It's been almost textbook in the way in which the military sees power.
Yes, and you have to wonder where they possibly could have gotten the assistance to form some sort of wall, some sort of wall around the internet. Say a Great Wall maybe around their internet.
Yeah, exactly.
So, moving on, I know you guys wanted to talk about a certain surface warfare group.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
and
Right, here we
you've
go.
been
This
you've
this
been
is the British
bothering me
segment.
all
Yeah.
damn week about this thing, so I'll let you
So
guys
yes,
go
June.
ahead.
All right. So moving on from power infrastructure, the crisis in Texas and Myanmar, we thought it'll be fitting to discuss the United Kingdom's coming carrier strike group 21, which will be sailing to the South China Sea later this year. Well, it's quite exciting, isn't it, lads? To be honest,
It is indeed.
being out of the game for so long in the carrier strike game, and now we're back bigger than before. And
It's been
I know
since
Technical
2010.
is, yeah, exactly. It's quite exciting for us. I know he's sat back in America right now. He's like, yeah, we've got God knows how many carriers at sea at any given one. So he's like, I don't know what these guys are getting excited about, but for us, it's quite something
it's
to be back in the
incredible
game.
to once again have that carrier strike capability. Obviously, with the retirement of HMS Ark Royal and the Harriers right back in 2010 after the Defence Review, it has been a long time, and it still amazes me really that we've gone so long without that carrier strike capability. Particularly when you consider that just months after the Harriers and the HMS Ark Royal were retired, we were obviously out in Libya, working with the UN, dealing with Colonel Gaddafi. And then obviously since then we've had Op Shader in Syria and Iraq, dealing with terrorist group ISIL, and just everything else as well that we've been dealing with, hurricanes in the Caribbean and so on. So yeah, it's good to be back in the game, as the Royal Navy keeps calling it.
I was going to say, in
Yeah.
terms of an interesting topic I think to talk about is the escorts for the vessel. Obviously, we know from the Royal Navy aspect it's going to be 2 Type 45s and 2 Type 23s. But in terms of the multinational effort, we know the US have announced an Arleigh Burke's going to be sent. I cannot remember the name of which one.
One of them. We
One
have
of-
we
what-
have a lot.
Wasn't it the
one of the
Sutherland?
many of.
I'm under the impression that it will initially, when the deployment begins, it will be one of the DDGs stationed out of Rota in Spain, because obviously the US has 4 of the destroyers based there as a forward deployment, and then at some point after the stint in the Mediterranean, it'll swap over to one of the ships deployed in sort of Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. One probably, I would assume if they're operating in the South China Sea, probably one out of Sasebo in Japan. That would be probably expected, and they may link up. Oh, correction. I would expect them to link up with other U.S. assets in the South China Sea, and potentially go through some multinational exercises.
I was going to say, we certainly seem to think the Dutch are going to be involved, certainly for at least the first leg of the journey towards Suez.
Yeah, and we do now know that the Navy is planning to make a visit at some point either to Greece or at the very least to Cyprus.
Greece is seemingly being confirmed as it'll be soon.
Yeah.
It looks to be
Yeah,
soon.
the Greek government confirmed it this week.
So I would expect to see Italian, French, and maybe Greek assets joining at various points during the trip through the Mediterranean. And then obviously beyond that, once we actually get out past the Suez and into the Persian Gulf and beyond, Australia has indicated, Japan has also indicated their intent to join the task group at some point.
I think most by this point, most of the G20 is.
Obviously, ships will be swapping in and out as the carrier strike group moves around the world, but it's fairly safe to say she's not going to be lacking escorts. And obviously, we also know that there will be a submarine, at least one, sailing with the group. At the moment, it's believed to be planned that one of the Astute class in the Royal Navy will be sailing with the carrier strike group. But given the sheer number of American subs out there, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we find out there's an American sub with them, maybe even an Australian one.
I would anticipate the U.S. at least attempts to throw a couple of Los Angeles classes at the formation, at least for training purposes at minimum.
Yeah.
Also, as well, though,
I
I think
think
was
it's
one of the more interesting points is the fact that the Type 23s are seemingly going to be armed with a Wildcat instead of a Merlin.
Yeah, and we had a quick discussion about this earlier because obviously, generally speaking, the Type 23 frigate is intended as an anti-submarine warfare vessel. It's fitted with all of the necessary sonar equipment, anti-submarine torpedoes, and the Merlin is very much the Royal Navy's primary anti-submarine aircraft, at least at the moment, until the P8 Poseidon properly comes online. So the use of the Wildcat is an interesting pick for the Type 23. It might be because there's going to be loads of Merlins on board the carrier itself, and obviously the Wildcat has recently undergone fitting out with these new Martlet missiles for anti-ship warfare, particularly for dealing with fast attack boats, which is obviously going to be a major concern when the carrier strike group gets into the Persian Gulf.
Wait, that's even going to be a concern if you're heading through the Suez Canal, because I know the Marlets can mainly do naval units, but it can be sent to attack ground units as well. And going through the Suez Canal is still probably one of the most risky points on the journey.
Mm.
Yeah, and also, of course, once you're sailing near Yemen, that becomes risky in a lot of different ways, especially with the number of groups that are associated with the Houthis, and
well,
also,
I mean, we've already seen that capability to knock out ships.
Yeah,
They've knocked out
just
Saudi
about to
ships in the
say.
past.
Yeah,
I mean, we came close. I mean, the Saudi Navy came close to losing, and I mean, actually losing a frigate at the bottom of the ocean because I believe it was a suicide boat, something like that. There was a radio control. I don't know what the acronym is, but it was a boat packed full of explosives, was rammed into the side of a frigate, and listed to the extent in which they nearly had to abandon ship. So it's no joke. It's no photo opportunity the way they're going. It's to prove that operationally it's capable, and no threat will be able to penetrate the defences. I'm trying to find the right words.
Yeah,
it's what we've got to
very
remember, of course, is that
poignant
the Type 45
deployment.
and Type 23s, they are high-end assets, and particularly with the air defence side of things, because obviously the Houthis have been quite renowned recently for their air attacks with drones. Saudi Arabia has had to deal with so much of that. But obviously these are high-end assets, and they are largely equipped with very large, very expensive missiles designed for taking out high-value targets. And so obviously the martlets are going to be so important for dealing with these low-cost boats and low-end unmanned vehicles that are such a risk now in modern warfare compared with, say, 40, 50 years ago.
yeah, and it's another reason why the U.S. has been so heavy, at least on implementing laser defense systems on our ships, or at least actively testing and going down that route, is just because dealing with that, those cheap drone attacks and, small boats, is it's really, really hard to waste a multi-million-dollar missile against, a $50, or not 50, but of course like $500 pile of, foam and cardboard and a few electronics and some explosives. And it gets down to that question of, what does the UK have right now on, on the Type 45s and the Type 23s to actually deal with, small drones? I mean, do they have drone interdiction systems currently deployed?
It's literally just the Phalanx Seawiz, one on each side of the Type 45s, and then a similar outfit on the Type 23s. And that's all well and good. And don't get me wrong, we obviously have seen over Iraq the CRAM, which is based on the same defense system. We've obviously seen how useful that has been for the most part in intercepting rockets and stuff that have been coming in. But obviously, it has a limited range. And although Seawiz can be used against surface targets, is probably not something that the Navy will be overly keen on using in the crowded waters of the Persian Gulf. Because even with a 3.5 kilometre maximum range on the gun, you don't want to, by the time that they've positively identified what is coming towards them and whether or not it's a threat, they're already close enough that there is a risk to the ships, there's a risk to the strike group itself.
Yeah, and swarm attacks as well may be a potential issue, especially once you start coupling that with not just drones, attacks with the sort of the swarming philosophy, but also utilizing multiple attack methods, anti-ship missiles and fast boats. You can run into a lot of issues where you can start saturating defenses.
Yeah, and we've obviously seen there was an astonishing satellite image from it was November last year of one of the US carriers passing through the Persian Gulf, and the satellite image just showing behind the ship just a swarm of Iranian boats of various kinds, and we are literally talking hundreds of these little boats just following the carrier at a distance, and that is obviously something that concerns the US. It concerns the UK as well. I'm sure the French have had concerns about it when they've passed through in recent times. But it's definitely at the moment the technology is somewhat lagging behind the threat in that regard. Laser weapons will do a lot to try and fix that problem. Obviously, most of these boats will be sailing with extra machine guns mounted on the railings. But it will be interesting to see, particularly with Iran, how they play out their response to the UK carrier strike group coming through.
And it'll also be interesting to see what happens when the carrier strike group travels through the South China Sea itself, and we're concentrating on the areas which it will pass to get to its destination. There is the one question that needs asking is what will happen when the Chinese are faced with a multinational task force in such a size and capability right in their back garden.
I'll offer my take on it, which I don't think it'll go through the Taiwan Strait, which is obviously that would cause a whole host of issues. But however, we've seen the US carrier that's deployed in the South China Sea at the minute near the Philippines, when the Chinese aircraft have been coming when they enter Taiwan's air defense zone. If you look at the maps published where the aircraft have been tracked to, they've gone directly over in and around the areas where the carrier is.
Yeah, and
so I think you'll get probably the visit by Chinese aircraft, probably as you would if you sailed a carrier next to Russia. But I think a lot of it'll be a lot of just diplomatic shouting from them.
Yeah, a lot of the issues right now are, of course, the Chinese realizing that they can get away with a lot. Well, and at the end of the day, sailing ships through the South China Sea doesn't really do that much. As long as the Chinese can continue building air bases in the region and continuing to exert their influence over smaller nations in, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, which and they know that. They know that, at the end of the day, a couple of carrier strike groups, sailing through the South China Sea isn't an issue for them because it distracts from the larger problem.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think, as Jordan said, it's more diplomatic. We're back post-Brexit even. At an extent, you could say post-Brexit. Personally, I think it has a lot to do with that, considering the destinations where it's stopping and, where it's being showcased.
Yeah, it's to an extent, it's kind of more a reassurance to our fellow Commonwealth.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, the key port visits once we hit Indo-Pacific are going to be sort of Australia, looking at potentially passing South Korea, going past Japan.
I think possibly Singapore as well with the naval base that's already we've got there.
Yeah.
Well, the support unit technically.
Yeah. We may even see a brief visit past Hong Kong. Obviously, the situation over there is still fairly fluid from all the protests last year and China's new national security law that they've enforced in there. And obviously the British government has continued to express its dissatisfaction with the way that China's behaving there. So I would expect a show of force at the very least, with the carrier maybe sailing past Hong Kong, even if it's just for a photo shoot or something, just to say to China, look, we are here, we're back, and you need to pay attention to what we're saying because we're not happy and we are prepared to do something about it.
I think, look, we've seen the rhetoric that China's shouted about just in the announcements of the groups going to head into that region, and I think when the group does head in the region, they'll up like what they say diplomatically, but it's for actually doing anything. I just don't see them doing anything of just. It's more of just a safe face, really, for them.
And it's not that they're not capable of doing anything. That is something we need to stress very, very clearly. China's military capabilities have come on leaps and bounds in the last.
They've probably got one of the best anti-ship missile capabilities, like certainly like land-based ASMs out there.
Yeah, 100%. The cruise missiles and now even anti-ship ballistic missiles are a huge concern, and it's something that the Americans have been very, very keenly aware of, and it's been part of a major discussion over there, which we won't go into in detail today, regarding the future of aircraft carriers in general, because obviously with the anti-ship capabilities that China has and the sheer number of missiles they can fire, the chances of a US carrier being sunk in a conflict is just so high now that there are groups in the States that are lobbying to say shrink the size of the carriers or even don't have carriers anymore. I mean, obviously, there's 4 ships of the Gerald R. Ford class up on order now. One of them's already completed, 2 more are under construction. They've announced the name of the 4th. But there is talk at the moment that may well prove to be it for the class. Obviously, the Nimitz class at the minute there's 10 ships. Plan was that Fords would replace like for like 10 ships, maybe even an 11th, just to cover the retirement of the Enterprise back in 2011. But at the moment, there's very little movement. And again, with the new administration in the States at the minute, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they're prepared to invest money into new carriers. And potentially, if they don't, it's going to make Britain's carriers all the more important for NATO's presence around the world.
Yeah, and one of the
exactly.
second
and also
go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say about how certain. I mean, you mentioned the US groups involved in one drink or together carriers. It's a matter of does a certain body or administration value diplomacy, trade to do with hard power, soft power, whatever you want to call it, traveling around the world in an aircraft carrier, as cliche as that may sound. Do they value that more, or do they value a long-standing presence in which, unfortunately, there is a growing threat towards that carrier? It's finding that balance between diplomacy, trade, and eventually putting thousands of lives at risk due to evolving technologies and anti-ship warfare and a missile capability.
And this debate did happen towards the tail end of the Cold War, between the U.S. and Russia, when it came to the question of, Russian anti-ship missile capabilities were really starting to come into their stride in the 80s, and we had this sort of debate of whether or not to sort of reframe our naval forces into a different form that could properly counter the advanced Russian anti-ship missile capability. And really the side that was talking about being more aggressive with aircraft carriers won. And we're seeing that same debate now. Of course, our aircraft carrier doctrine is a bit more established at this point. So we're seeing that we're seeing it go sort of in that direction still. But that's definitely going to become a debate in the next 20 years probably. In addition, we're trying to fight, both the U.S. and Great Britain are trying to fight 2 wars at the same time, trying to fight brown waters against small ships and the traditional blue water against a major peer opponent,
Mm.
which becomes something to try to manage, and definitely trying to manage that is a difficult thing.
Yeah, and I mean a primary
Yeah.
example of how difficult that has become is the littoral combat ship program in the US, which was supposed to have been sort of a replacement for frigates, primarily aimed at doing the near shore side of missions. But obviously now that's kind of fallen through. The US has recognised it still needs traditional frigates.
Yeah,
Um,
that program is dead.
yeah, we've obviously seen the Constellation class now coming online, and although the littoral combat ships have actually ended up doing, blue water deployments, we've seen one of them recently, I believe it was Connecticut, actually sailed all the way out across the Pacific on its own. Although they have that capability, like you say, the project in that regard is well and truly dead. And I think that is something else that the Americans are going to have to consider as well. And it's a lesson for the UK. Obviously, we've now got the Type 31, and as of very late last year, early this year, the announcement about Type 32 frigate program coming on. It will be a lesson for the UK to make sure that we don't make that mistake, that we make sure these are genuine frigates and not sort of littoral combat capability focused ship. Yes, we need a variety of weapons, as we've already discussed, to deal with the low end technologies that are proving to be so dangerous in warfare now, stuff like the drones and these rockets and stuff. But we also need to make sure that we don't lose the high end capability for warfighting when we're dealing with people like Iran and China, and obviously there is still the threat from North Korea and other places.
Yeah, and a lot of it is that the fighting the two wars at once, fighting against those peer opponents and then fighting against, less, not as peer but still very dangerous opponents like Iran, where they have the ability, yes, to deploy a large number of anti-ship missiles, which can cause a lot of issues for just any ship operating in the area. And I mean, obviously the littoral combat ship program had some glaring flaws. On paper, it seemed like a great idea. And of course that's why the military decided to go through it. But it ended up being sort of it was too early for the technology trying to be implemented on the platform. Where they were trying to implement stealth, laser systems, modularity, and then, that high power output engine package. And it just all sort of came together to be a massive mess. Where they basically tried to test a bunch of systems all on a new platform, and it just you'd never do that. You never do that, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, and they've had kind of a lot of the same problems with the Ford class carriers, obviously with the new emails launch system and all the various radars and other sensors that they've incorporated on it. And you can see where they've learned from that with the Constellation class frigates, where they've literally gone and taken an off-the-shelf hull design from an allied country and then just mounted known, tried and tested equipment, weapons and sensors to it.
Yeah, and we spent a very large amount of money to learn that lesson. And going forward, I think we'll take that lesson in stride and definitely use proven systems in addition to new systems, and try not to create an entire new platform with entire new systems all at once, because that just ends up blowing a bunch of money at the end of the day. That's it.
But yeah, obviously as we're just bringing this topic towards a close, the British carrier strike group deployment this year will be a real test not only for the UK but also really for America, because they will get to see how China and Iran and other countries are responding to the return of British carriers, and it may well help influence their decision with regards to the future of the Ford class and their carrier ethos in general. Obviously, they've recently started deploying the amphibious assault ships like the USS Wasp and the USS America, with F-35s on board as sort of light aircraft carriers rather than the traditional amphibious assault role.
Yeah, that sea control sort of setup.
Yeah, which is a concept they've been looking at really for more than 30 years now. But yeah, it will be a huge test for that, and it could very well shape the future of carrier deployment and the future of the aircraft carrier across the world quite significantly, because obviously at the minute it's Britain, France, Russia, China, and the US who have sort of fully operational, fully functional carriers. And Russia, sort of to a lesser extent, obviously, with the accidents that they've had recently, and the fact that they can't commit at the moment financially to a new carrier. So I'm sure there will be a keen watch as well from Russia to see how the deployment goes and make a decision from that as to whether they're going to invest in new carriers or whether they're going to look at other capabilities.
Yeah, and going back to that debate between large single, massive aircraft carrier platforms, 5,000 plus crew, and something closer to the America class, where you see this smaller ship, not faster, but definitely able to operate in different conditions with a lower escort, capacity, but still able to project a large amount of power, with, of course, the F-35. And you see that sort of as the counterpoint, and sort of as people have started to make that argument for smaller carriers. But speaking about near-peer opponents that are, or less than peer opponents that are still dangerous, getting into the final topic for today, South America. And the activity that we've been seeing.
Before we do, I just wanted to say for anyone listening, if you're not hearing Jordan too much, Intel Air and Sea, that is, he's gone to take his dogs for a walk. So it's just three of us for the moment. So yeah, just to clarify.
Yeah, well, he'll be back to yell at us about my being wrong about South America in a bit. But the new action that we've been seeing over the past few weeks, that's possibly related to the new Biden administration, but going back to the point we talked about earlier, is trying to weed through, what is new, what isn't new, what is an evolution of what's on the ground, and what is just from the new administration. So, linked down below are going to be a few tweets that I sent out over the past couple of weeks about new activity. We've seen a lot of new recon activity. There's an RC-135 that's been off the coast of Cuba fairly frequently now, doing signals intelligence work and definitely snooping on Cuba. What it's spying, we don't know yet. I've been trying to sort through and see if I can find any new any new information about any new activity the Cuban military may be doing, or potentially the Chinese. Someone pointed me in that direction that it may be related to Chinese activity in Cuba. And then we're seeing more special operations activity both in South and Central America. A lot of C-146s traveling around Colombia. They're primarily for special operations transport. They look like civilian airliners, but the point is to transport around special operations personnel and equipment. So it's going to be interesting to see what they're doing. They've been traveling, interestingly, to some cities on the border with Venezuela. So, everyone can have their conspiracy theories about what's happening. But one of the things that we can identify is that there has been a significant amount of new activity.
Yeah. And it's interesting because particularly with this Venezuela side of things, we've not really seen a huge amount of US air activity since pretty much that entire Venezuela situation really began, which was probably 2019 now. It feels like it's been ages.
It's been on and off, sort of back and forth for the past, I would say, since probably 2017 is when it ramped up a bit more. Of course, the Juan Guaido situation drove some additional activity, and we definitely saw that drive some unrest, both in Venezuela and, of course, the U.S. backed him, which, I would say it destabilized the situation, but that's what the U.S. was going for at the time.
Yeah, and obviously we saw later on, obviously the US intercepting a number of tankers coming from Iran to Venezuela to provide Maduro and his regime with fuel and money, and then we've obviously had also the Russian air activity flying across the Atlantic into Venezuela, and supposedly shipping out Venezuela's gold reserves last year.
And Iran as well has been flying a large number of cargo aircraft, and also airlines have now been making more trips between Iran and Venezuela. And there were reports, at least, that Iran was exchanging military material for Venezuelan gold, just because Iran needs that capital and Venezuela needs the weapons. And Iran, at least right now, has access to Chinese and Russian equipment that Venezuela does not. So we're possibly seeing Venezuela get their hands on some more advanced systems due to Iranian trading.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, we're obviously postulating right now. We don't know what's coming in and out. We just are seeing the flight activity, which gives us an idea of how much of something is going there. All we can see right now is there's a lot. There is a heck of a lot.
And a brilliant source of information from the Osint community for Venezuela is conflicts, and he's been focusing on Venezuela quite significantly for well over a year now, with a lot of this flight activity he's been keeping tabs on, and he's been managing to get photos from the ground at some of the bases where these aircraft have been landing. And we did obviously see at one point there were Russian contractors, if you like, sort of paid militiamen.
Yeah, we're using some very large air quotes here when we say contractors.
Yeah. Obviously, the way that Russia deals with things is very different to how everyone else does it. But these are effectively Russian citizens armed with Russian weapons, but going in and having absolutely nothing to do, if you believe that, with the Russian government and its intentions. There was photos of them arriving at various points early on in 2020, various bits of equipment on both Russian and Iranian chartered flights.
Obviously, the Russian government is, supporting Venezuela as a way to either distract the U.S. or, give the U.S. some issues sort of in its backyard in a similar way to how we're acting in Syria. Russia is trying to cause us issues, sort of, in what we consider our home turf. Obviously, there are a lot of debates on U.S. influence in South and Central America, but the Russians are definitely assisting the Venezuelan government right now in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. And it's interesting that initially, at least, the reaction from a lot of the other South American countries, Brazil and Chile and some of the others, was quite strongly, please America, don't get involved here. But at the same time, also sort of looking across their own borders towards Venezuela with a great deal of concern. And that seems to have subsided for the most part. And I don't know if that's down to things not being quite as volatile, perhaps now, early 2021, as it were 12 months ago, or if that's just the fact that they've kind of accepted the situation is what it is, or maybe there's
a lot of South American countries have been dealing with COVID for the past 12 months, which has given them a lot of distractions, at least, both military-wise. Of course, the military has been operating internally in all these countries, trying to assist with recovery and fighting the virus, which has definitely diverted a lot of military attention. Politically, of course, the leadership is paying a lot of attention to COVID internally, and the caseloads have just made it fighting a war right now would not exactly be advantageous for any of these countries. So they've definitely toned down the rhetoric in the last 12 months. Even we're seeing in Brazil, we're seeing the rhetoric surprisingly quiet for what the situation is.
Yeah, and there was a period, I know a couple of years ago, everyone will remember, where there was a strong belief that President at the time, Trump, would take direct military action against Venezuela. And suddenly, you know, that whole thing just sort of dropped off a cliff, and the relationship between Venezuela and the United States just it died, but it was never sort of heard of again. And the Venezuela issue just is still a silent issue, in which, you know, the geopolitical landscape has shifted away from it, but at the end of the day, as you say, it is still ongoing. And you know, there is indication that the situation is hotting up again, maybe.
Yeah, and the fact that we made it through John Bolton's tenure as National Security Advisor without bombing a foreign country was fairly impressive, I must say. And you know, it all comes down to the issue of what is politically acceptable right now, at least inside the U.S. And I don't think a proactive war or an offensive war is really politically advantageous to any party right now. Where no one's really going to fight for something like that. And unless a country provokes in some meaningful way, most action will continue to stay clandestine.
And on that topic, it is interesting. Obviously, we've had, as I'll cover later in the news brief, we've had the attack on Erbil Airport and targeting US forces there at the start of this week. And it's interesting because obviously with the previous administration, there was a very, very clear red line there, where if any member of the US forces was injured or killed, there was going to be military response. And yet with the new administration, there's definitely been a shift there, because we've obviously had the injuries that have taken place and the death of a contractor there this week. And there's been very little from the new administration in terms of action. There's been plenty of words. There's been, you know, they issued a formal statement sort of within 12 hours of the event taking place. But there's been very little else said about it since then. Certainly not from any of the, you know, senior defense officials or the president or anything like that.
Yeah, a lot of statements, not a lot of action. And that sort of has been the last, I don't know, last year and a half in a nutshell. A lot of statements, very little action. Apart from the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which, you know, we're now going on over a year later.
So that gives the deck as well after that.
Yeah, we're seeing again, going back to the Mossadegh, it's clandestine. Apart from you see the difference that you know, a year has done, where we've gone from, you know, open actions against Soleimani to more you know, clandestine actions against, you know, Mossadegh, and sort of the appetite for a prolonged conflict has absolutely dropped off in every single country. Mostly because countries do not want to fight with COVID as an issue, because it just it reduces the ability of a country to wage war. Both domestically causing issues and, of course, among the ranks of service members. The U.S. has started to vaccinate frontline deployed personnel, which is definitely going to give the U.S. an edge. And other countries will see, you know, who decides to start vaccinating service personnel first.
Yeah, and that's important. I mean, I'm not sure yet that we have in the UK such a scheme, as I'm aware. I believe that it goes by age and vulnerability, vaccination schemes. I'm not sure that frontline armed forces personnel are currently receiving it as part of a group. And that's somewhere which the United States is obviously prioritised, alongside a few other countries, which is interesting, really, because it's different priorities, different governments, and it becomes evident.
Yeah, that sort of, it also has to do with the U.S. our strategy of vaccination, which is sort of everything from the very local level up to state level, and then federal, of course, is responsible for the military and vaccinating personnel. So you're sort of seeing these different spheres of responsibility, and who has access to vaccines and who's providing vaccines. And you know, I think actually I did forget Israel, is the country I was trying to think of that has most likely, though they have not made it as public as some people would like, they definitely have vaccinated a large portion of their armed forces. So they definitely have a leg up
It's
on.
around hard.
In fairness, with Israel, they have been very much ahead of the
Yeah, I
game
was just about to say there's a lag on my
overall. Because obviously with them, they were one of the very first countries to start developing a vaccine. They were one of the very first countries to do some testing for it and start rolling out their vaccine system. And if I recall correctly, I read somewhere this week that they've done well over half of their own population already, and they're now looking at sending their vaccines overseas to help other countries catch up, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that again, it's part of the application of soft power is who do they give their vaccines to? Who do they make friends with? Of course, one of the issues right now in U.S. Canadian relationships is we may have promised Canada access to vaccines, and we're a bit slow on delivering right now. So that's caused some issues in the Canadian public and has definitely impacted their view, at least on both on the Trump and Biden administration, to be honest, has definitely been hit in the Canadian public's eye because of this vaccine access issue.
Yeah, and I think that it also links, as John and I very well know, to the, let's say, deteriorating relationship between the EU and UK when it comes to vaccines. I mean, there's been this whole thing for a few weeks now about a supply of vaccines, about debates over orders and misinformation via senior leaders, European leaders, over vaccines. And it's interesting that something of such unity has managed to actually be so divisive in terms of its impact.
Mm. And just it's worth remembering as well that particularly with South America at the minute, there has been very little talk in most of those countries. I think Brazil possibly being the exception about vaccines, because as you said, Osinttechnical, there's been a lot of sort of cases there, and their case levels have been a lot higher perhaps than in parts of Europe. And they really are obviously struggling to catch up with developing vaccines or even just getting hold of vaccines, while countries like the US, the EU and stuff are struggling to produce enough for themselves as it is.
Yeah, and that's a place where China is going to get a very, very, very big lead, especially with Sinopharm's capabilities in producing vaccines and their speed in just chucking out a traditional vaccine. And we've already seen China has started delivering vaccines to African nations.
Yeah.
Links will be, of course, down below for some tweets on that. But that's definitely something that's going to further improve their standing. And as we see China increase their soft power applications, around Africa and around the Indian Ocean region.
And the vaccines can help countries do that, as we've seen, as we've been discussing. It's not just become a tool for herd immunization, but it's a tool for soft power.
Yeah,
and exports.
Yeah,
certain countries. It's an excellent tool, really.
Yeah, and as we see, China has taken a different strategy than the U.S. and the U.K., which has been primarily, in the U.S. and the U.K. vaccinating their own population first, and then once we sort of get done with getting through our own vaccine stockpile, start sending it out to other places. China's position has been more using vaccines first as an application of soft power, and in order to give those vaccines to other countries to increase their standing. Future Technical here with some slightly bad news to interject with. This was just brought to my attention. It seems like the new COVID strains from Brazil and South Africa both seem to significantly decrease the effectiveness of the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. So we'll see where that goes, but back to your admittedly slightly cheerier news about vaccines. Sort of the strength of the Chinese state has allowed that.
John, do we want to move on to the news of the week that we haven't covered?
Yeah, in the news this week, a US Air Force T-38C Talon jet trainer tragically crashed in Alabama on Friday during a routine training flight. The two pilots who were on board at the time have tragically been declared dead. They were part of the 14th Flight Training Wing based at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi. One of the pilots was a US Air Force instructor, and it has emerged today that the other pilot was actually a Japanese Air Self-Defense Force officer who was in the US for training. As of the time of this recording, their names have not yet been released because obviously next of kin notifications take priority, but I'm sure we will be tweeting photos and names about that in due course. We've obviously also, earlier this week, we had, as part of the new US administration, the US ambassador to the United Nations notified the UN Security Council that it is withdrawing letters previously sent to the UN Security Council about Iran's breaches of the JCPOA nuclear agreement. For those of you not aware about that, the US has for some time been calling on the UN Security Council to impose further measures against Iran for its breaches, particularly with regards to the production of nuclear weapons material. And under the that was a very key focus under the Trump administration. But this week, in a very sudden U-turn, the Biden administration has turned around and said, actually, we're withdrawing those letters to the UN Security Council. And it seems to be either a case of appeasement towards Iran, or to try and make a genuine effort towards potential return to some sort of nuclear weapons restriction deal. But obviously only time will tell as to whether Iran decides to do something about that or whether they just carry on the way they are at the minute. Also in the news this week, China has admitted for the first time that 4 of its soldiers were killed in the border clashes with India last June. For months, the two nations were engaged in clashes along the mountainous terrain, with India admitting at the time to dozens of its own soldiers being killed and wounded in these fights. At the time, China never admitted that they'd had any casualties of their own, probably for political reasons and for morale purposes. But this week, the People's Liberation Army issued a statement confirming that 4 of its soldiers had in fact been killed, and that they've all been posthumously awarded their contributions to the defence of China. In the UK, a former RAF Avro Lancaster bomber, airframe NX-611, known as Just Jane, has taken another major step in her overhaul and reassembly. At the moment, there are 2 Lancasters worldwide that are still flying, one with the UK's Battle Britain Memorial flight, and the other with the Canadian Heritage flight. Under the current plan, Just Jane will become the 3rd Lancaster to return to the air, with the overhaul and repairs taking an estimated 10 years in total. At the moment, we're 3 years into the process. It's a very, very lengthy process because every single component of the aircraft has to be scrutinised to make sure that it is absolutely foolproof, that it's not going to fall apart under strain. So the project is expected to take another 7 years to complete, which is an awfully long time, but at a cost of just £4 million overall to get this incredibly historic aircraft back in the air for air shows and indeed for
worth it. It's all worth it, I say.
Yeah.
Insert a joke about Morris cars here, but yeah, go ahead.
A Pakistani naval exercise called Aman 21 concluded this week after 6 days of manoeuvres in the Indian Ocean. Ships from Pakistan, Russia, the US, China, Japan, and the UK took part. In light of our discussions earlier about the UK Carrier Strike Group, that's quite an interesting combination of nations being involved in this exercise. And I'm sure we'll get press releases about the exercise in due course. But that was quite an interesting naval exercise. That very little announcement about it, but some interesting photos from the Pakistani government. In the Middle East this week, HMS Montrose from the Royal Navy, with a detachment of Royal Marines on board, seized another £11 million worth of drugs from a series of dhows that they intercepted in that area. It brings the total amount of drugs seized by Royal Navy warships to more than £300 million since October 2020. That's not just in the Middle East, of course, that's also including counter-narcotics operations in the Caribbean and further afield. In a sad bit of news also in the UK this week, the RAF Charitable Trust confirmed that the Royal International Air Tattoo, or RIAT, Air Show for 2021 has been cancelled due to ongoing concerns with the COVID-19 pandemic. RIAT was due to celebrate its 50th anniversary this summer with what was due to be the biggest and best air show ever. But obviously that is now no longer going to be the case. So the RAF Charitable Trust is looking once again to run a virtual air tattoo over that same weekend, which for those of you who didn't catch it last year, it was actually very, very impressive what they managed to put together considering the short notice.
And very entertaining as well. Definitely recommend watching it when they put on the next one.
And brilliantly, you can watch it for free as well. So if you want to head over to their website or just Google RIAT 2021 for that. On Monday night, we obviously had, as we alluded to earlier, there was an attack on Erbil airport in Iraq, which left one civilian contractor dead, one US service member injured, and 8 other contractors injured. There were also at least 5 civilians who were injured by the attack. Some 14 rockets are believed to have been fired by a pro-Iran militia group late on Monday evening. The US, as we said, issued a statement condemning the attack, but has done very, very little else about the situation since then, in a stark change to the kind of response that we saw to previous attacks of this kind from the previous administration. Norway will deploy F-35s to Iceland for the first time as part of the NATO air policing mission to that country. 130 personnel will deploy alongside a detachment of jets to Keflavik Air Base. Norway has previously deployed F-16s to Iceland in 2009, 2011, 2014 and 2016. But this year the deployment will be the F-35 only. As Tom alluded to earlier as well, the US administration has chosen to remove the terrorist designation of the Yemen-based Houthi militia group, despite ongoing unmanned aircraft and rocket attacks by them against US ally Saudi Arabia. The announcement was more or less immediately followed by yet another attempt by the Houthis to attack 2 Saudi cities, with the Iranian-made Samad drones being shot down just before they arrived at Jeddah. Obviously, also not quite this week, but in a week or 2 ago now, the US also began withdrawing its intentions to sell certain items of military equipment to Saudi and to the UAE. Again, a change based from this new US administration, and certainly something that we'll be keen to watch in light of this decision about the Houthis. And lastly, as Technical mentioned earlier, today, literally this evening, photos have emerged from the Syria-Iraq border showing the US Stinger missile systems on M1097 Avenger vehicles being transferred into Syria. And obviously, we don't know an awful lot about that at the moment, but the indication is that that's to provide additional protection to US bases in northern Syria amidst the current drawdown of US troops deployed to Iraq, following the Iraqi government's decision last year to withdraw its support for US presence in the country.
And as with everything, links will be down below to all of our sources, including tweets from us and some additional information as well, including stuff like pictures of the rockets and casings fired at Erbil airport earlier this week. And I think,
I think with that pretty much covers it, doesn't it?
Yeah, so thank you everyone for listening. Of course, thank you Tom coming at us from his nuclear bunker somewhere under Slough, and Defense Geek sitting on a Type 23 somewhere in the Indian Ocean. I think we can wrap that up for this episode. Thank you everyone for listening, and we will have an episode same time, same place next week.